The affair was, by any measure, a masterpiece of devotion. For 27 years, King Caitian had marked Queen Alara's birthday not as a footnote in the eternal calendar of his court, but as its gravitational center. Each year, the celebration grew more magnificent, a testament not only to his power but to his peculiar, enduring fascination with her mortality. Tonight, for her 47th, the great hall of the Onyx Citadel was a galaxy of captured starlight. Thousands of candles floated in the vaulted dark above, their flames reflected in the polished obsidian floor until it seemed they were all dining in the heart of a midnight sky. The air was thick with the scent of winter roses and spiced wine, a heady perfume that clung to the velvet draperies and the furs of the assembled noble houses. Alara sat at the high table, a throne of carved ironwood at her back, Caitian a solid, cool presence at her side. The fine wool of her gown, the color of clotted cream, was a soft weight against her skin. On her throat lay the serpent's tear, a diamond so flawless it seemed to drink the candlelight and breathe it back as pure, cold fire. It had been his first gift to her, all those years ago. A king's promise. Her fingers, a cartographer's map of fine lines that he had once claimed to love, rested on the stem of her goblet. The wine within, a deep, blood-dark vintage, trembled with the faint tremor of the musician's strings. She felt the familiar, pleasant hum of the evening settle over her, the weight of his arm resting on the back of her chair a comforting pressure. She was seen. She was cherished. This was the story they had written together, a human queen in a court of immortals, a paradox held in place by the sheer force of a king's will. She watched the faces in the hall. Lord Valerus, with his chiseled, ancient face, raising a glass in a gesture of cool respect. Lady Serafina, her beauty a sharp, cruel thing, offering a smile that never quite reached her predatory eyes. They were a parliament of predators, sleek and beautiful and utterly lethal, and for 2.5 decades, they had bent the knee to her. To Alara, the woman from a forgotten village, whose only power was the love of their king. She had learned their language of silences, their intricate dances of power and obligation. She had carved out a space for herself not through fear, but through a quiet, unyielding grace that they had, over time, mistaken for strength. Perhaps she had mistaken it for strength, too. Caitian leaned toward her, his voice a low murmur against her ear, a sound that still, after all this time, could smooth the anxieties from her soul. "Are you happy, my heart?" His lips were cool against her temple, a ghost of a kiss. The endearment, once a breathless secret whispered in the dark, was now a public declaration, another jewel in her crown. "I am," she said, and it was the truth. The hall, the music, the carefully orchestrated adoration, it was all for her. A monument to her. She turned to meet his gaze, and his eyes, the color of a twilight storm, held her. In them, she saw the echo of the young, reckless king who had stolen her away, the man who had promised her a world she could not have imagined. He had kept his promise. He had given her a kingdom, a title, and a love that felt as vast and eternal as his own unnatural lifespan. He smiled, a slow, breathtakingly familiar expression that softened the severe lines of his face. It was a smile meant only for her, a secret language in a room full of watchers. He squeezed her shoulder gently, a gesture of possession and affection so intertwined she had long ago stopped trying to separate them. Then he stood. The motion was fluid, commanding. A king rising. Instantly, a hush fell over the great hall. The music faltered, the strings dying in a mournful sigh. The chatter ceased. Every face, from the lowest-born vampire fledgling to the most ancient of his council, turned toward the throne. 1,000 pairs of predatory eyes, fixed on him. And on her. The silence was absolute, a heavy velvet blanket smothering all sound. It was the silence of anticipation, the collective held breath of a court that lived and died by its monarch's whims. Caitian's hand left her shoulder, and she felt the absence like a sudden chill. He raised his own goblet, the crimson wine catching the light like a liquid ruby. His voice, when he spoke, filled the cavernous space effortlessly. It was a voice forged over centuries, imbued with power and a resonance that could soothe a rebellion or declare a war. "Tonight," he began, his gaze sweeping the hall before returning, finally, to settle on her, "we celebrate a miracle. We celebrate my queen." A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. He let it build, then quieted it with a subtle lift of his hand. For 27 years, Ilara has been the heart of this court. She has brought a warmth this citadel had not known in 1,000 winters. Her wisdom and her grace have been a gift to us all. He paused, and his eyes softened with what looked, to all the world, like genuine, profound love. Ilara felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a foolishly human reaction. She lowered her gaze to the table, to the intricate patterns carved into the dark wood, feeling the weight of every stare in the room. This was more than his usual tribute. There was a gravity to his words tonight, a sense of occasion that felt different. Final. Her life, he continued, his voice dropping into a more intimate register, though it still carried to the farthest corner, is a precious, fleeting thing. A reminder of the beauty that can be found in fragility. He looked directly at her now, and her heart gave a painful throb. She knew he meant it as a compliment, the highest one he could conceive. He was praising her mortality. But a king must look beyond his heart. He must look to the future. To the continuation of his line. To the security of his kingdom. A knot of unease began to form in Ilara's stomach, cold and tight. This was not the speech she had been expecting. This was the language of statecraft, of politics. The words were for the court, not for her. The alliances that protect us are as fragile as any mortal life, Cation declared, his voice hardening again, becoming the king's. They require sacrifice. They require bonds of blood, not just of affection. 4 years, I have wrestled with this truth, seeking a path that honors my heart while fulfilling my duty. He took a deep breath, and the silence in the hall became so profound Ilara could hear the frantic, terrified beat of her own human heart. The serpent's tear on her neck felt suddenly impossibly heavy, a cold stone against her skin. And so, tonight, on this most joyous of occasions, I give a gift not only to my queen, but to the kingdom itself. A promise of stability. A bridge to our most powerful allies. A future for our people. He turned his head slightly, his gaze moving toward the great arched doorway at the far end of the hall. The heavy oak doors began to swing inward, silent as a tomb opening. I have bound us to the house of Cyrillus. I have secured our borders for the next 5 centuries. Tonight, I present to you, and to my beloved Ilara, her sister queen. The words did not register at first. They were sounds, syllables detached from meaning, like a phrase in a foreign tongue. Sister queen. The term was an absurdity, a constitutional impossibility. There was one king, one queen. That was the law. That was the promise. Her mind scrambled for context, for an explanation that did not shatter the world she knew. Perhaps it was a title? An honorary position for a valued ally's daughter? But then she saw the girl. Framed in the doorway, flanked by 2 of Cation's royal guard, stood a figure so young she seemed barely more than a child. She was dressed in silver, a stark contrast to Ilara's cream, and her hair was the color of spun moonlight. She was beautiful, of course. All of them were. But it was a fragile, terrified beauty. Her eyes, wide and the color of a summer sky, darted around the hall, taking in the sea of ancient, watching faces. She trembled, a leaf in the wind. And on her finger, a ring, the sigil of the royal house, a mirror image of the one Ilara herself wore. The world narrowed to a single, sharp point of agony. The murmurings in the hall erupted into a low, shocked roar, a wave of sound that washed over Ilara without touching her. She felt nothing. She was a statue carved from ice, the warmth of the hall a distant memory. The scent of roses was suddenly cloying, funereal. The candlelight seemed to mock her, each flame a tiny, dancing demon of celebration. Her celebration. Her birthday. Cation was still speaking, his voice a drone beneath the noise of the court. He was explaining the politics, the necessity. The girl, Lyra, was the last of her line. The marriage would unite their territories, prevent a catastrophic war. An heir of her bloodline would solidify the treaty for all time. He spoke of it as a triumph of diplomacy. A logical, elegant solution to a complex problem. He did not seem to notice that he had just taken a chisel to the foundations of Ilara's entire existence. He gestured for the girl to approach. Lyra walked, her steps hesitant, her silver gown whispering against the obsidian floor. She looked like a sacrifice being led to an altar. As she drew closer, Elara could see the pulse beating in the girl's slender throat, a frantic, frightened bird. She was mortal. Like her. Another fragile, beautiful thing for the king to admire. The girl stopped before the high table and executed a flawless, trembling curtsy. She did not look at Cation. Her eyes, filled with a terror that was achingly familiar to Elara, were fixed on the floor. Cation placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, a gesture of presentation. Of ownership. Queen Lyra, he announced, his voice booming with a satisfaction that was obscene. And in that moment, Elara felt the world break. The ice that had encased her cracked, and something hot and sharp pierced through. It was not rage. Rage was a fire, and she felt only a profound, hollowing cold. It was the sound of a story ending. The story of Cation and Elara. He had not just brought another woman into their life, he had brought her into their story, announced her as the next chapter, while Elara was still living out her own. He had looked at her 47 years, at the lines on her face and the silver in her hair, and seen an ending. He was planning for a future that did not include her. She did not look at him. She could not. To look at him would be to shatter completely. Instead, she looked at the girl. At Lyra. This child who was her replacement. And she felt a surprising, devastating pang of something that was not hatred. It was pity. Slowly, with a grace she did not know she possessed, Elara lifted her own goblet. The hall quieted again, watching her. Waiting for her reaction. For the tears. For the fury. For the human drama they all craved. She would give them none of it. She raised the glass, the dark wine a perfect, still surface. She inclined her head, first to the court, then to the terrified girl in silver, and finally, without looking at him, in the general direction of the king. To the future, she said, her voice clear and steady. And she drank. The wine tasted of ashes. The walk back to her chambers was the longest of her life. The feast, fractured by the king's proclamation, had dissolved into a chaotic murmur of congratulations and conspiracies. No one met her eyes. As she descended from the high table, a path cleared before her as if she were a ghost, the courtiers melting away, their faces a blur of averted gazes and feigned preoccupation. They were afraid to be tainted by her sudden irrelevance. The silence that escorted her was a different kind than the one that had preceded the announcement. That had been a silence of respect, of anticipation. This was a silence of pity and discomfort. It was the silence of the tomb. Her guards fell into step behind her, their armored footfalls echoing her own on the polished stone floors. The cadence was familiar, a rhythm that had underscored her life for 27 years, but tonight it sounded like a funeral dirge. Each step carried her further from the woman she had been an hour ago. Queen Elara, the cherished human heart of an immortal court. Now, she was something else. A relic. A predecessor. The first wife. The corridors of the Onyx Citadel, usually a comfort in their vast, dark grandeur, felt alien and menacing. The tapestries depicting Cation's ancient victories seemed to mock her with their permanence. The gargoyles carved into the arches above seemed to leer. This place, the only home she had truly known as an adult, was no longer hers. Or, more accurately, it was no longer only hers. And that, she was beginning to understand, was the same as it not being hers at all. She reached the royal wing, the heavy, iron-strapped doors to their chambers standing closed. One of her guards moved to open them for her, but she raised a hand, stopping him. The gesture was small, but absolute. He froze, his hand hovering in the air. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the carved wood, at the twin dragons whose tails intertwined to form the handle. A symbol of their union. It was a lie. She pushed the door open herself. The hinges were perfectly oiled, silent. She stepped inside and the door swung shut behind her, the soft click of the latch sealing her in. The guard's footsteps receded down the hall, leaving her in a silence that was even more profound than the one in the corridor. The rooms were just as she had left them. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the chamber. The massive bed, draped in furs and velvet, was turned down for the night. On a small table near the window, A single winter rose, the same species that filled the great hall, sat in a crystal vase, a personal token from him left there that morning. Everything was a testament to their shared life, to an intimacy she had believed was inviolable. Now, each familiar object was an accusation. The books stacked on her nightstand, the shawl she had left draped over a chair, the very air, which held the faint, unique scent of him, sandalwood and cold night air, it was all part of a life that had just been declared insufficient. She walked to the immense, arched window that overlooked the sleeping city below. The lights of the mortal quarters were a faint sprinkle of gold against the darkness, a world away. She had stood at this window 1,000 times, often with his arms around her, his chin resting on her head. He had loved showing her the scope of his domain, the kingdom he protected. "Our kingdom," he would say. She now understood the unspoken caveat, "for as long as you are useful to it." Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass. She saw a woman poised on the edge of middle age. The candlelight was kind, but it could not hide the fine lines around her eyes, the subtle loosening of the skin along her jaw, the threads of silver woven into her dark hair. She had always seen these changes as marks of a life lived, of years spent loving and being loved. Cation had traced them with his fingers, called them beautiful. He had lied. Or, worse, he had believed it, until he hadn't. He had looked at this face, her face, and seen the march of time not as a shared journey, but as a political liability. The serpent's tear was a cold weight against her throat. With numb fingers, she reached up and unfastened the clasp. The diamond felt like a shard of ice in her palm. She set it down on the polished windowsill, the stone winking balefully in the firelight. A king's promise. Broken. Where was he? Part of her, a desperate, foolish part, had expected him to follow her immediately. To rush after her, to explain, to hold her and tell her it was all some terrible misunderstanding. But the silence stretched. He was with his court. He was with his new prize. He was accepting their congratulations, cementing his brilliant political maneuver. He was a king first. She had always known that. She had simply never understood that it meant she would, eventually, come second. The minutes bled into an hour. The fire in the hearth burned lower, the logs collapsing into a soft bed of embers. The silence in the room grew heavier, more absolute. It was the silence of abandonment. She did not cry. The shock had frozen her tears, leaving behind a clarity that was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. She saw everything now. She saw the 27 years not as a romance, but as a contract. She had provided him with companionship, with a performance of humanity that softened his monstrous image. In return, he had given her luxury, protection, and a counterfeit of love. And now, her part of the bargain was fulfilled. Her age, her mortality, had rendered her obsolete. She thought of the girl, Lyra. Barely 18, perhaps. Ripped from her home and family, a pawn in a game she didn't understand, married to a creature of immense power and unfathomable age. Ilara remembered her own terror, all those years ago. The awe and the fear. The slow process of learning to love a monster. She had succeeded. She had tamed him, or so she had thought. But you can never tame a king. You can only borrow his attention for a time. Lyra would have to learn that lesson, too. A quiet resolve began to crystallize in the cold emptiness of her chest. He had made his announcement before the entire kingdom. He had declared his intentions in the grandest, most public way possible. He had written her out of their future with a flourish. He expected her to accept this. To fade gracefully into the background, a dowager queen, a beloved relic he could visit when he felt sentimental. He expected her to stay. He had misjudged her. He had admired her fragility for so long, he had forgotten that anything that lives for 27 years in a court of predators must, by necessity, have a spine of iron. She would not stay. She would not be a ghost in her own life, watching him build a new one with a younger, more fertile version of herself. He had announced a new queen at her birthday feast. It was only fitting that she offer an announcement of her own. Not in a crowded hall, not with a king's pomp and circumstance. But it would be a statement nonetheless. A response. An ending of her own making. The door finally opened. The soft click of the latch was unnaturally loud in the silent room. Ilara did not turn from the window. She watched his reflection approach hers in the dark glass, a tall, powerful silhouette against the firelight. He stopped a few feet behind her, his presence a familiar weight in the air. For a long moment, he said nothing, and she knew he was reading the room, reading the rigid line of her back, the placement of the diamond on the sill. He was assessing the damage. Ilara, his voice was soft, cautious. It was the voice he used when approaching a frightened animal. It was not the voice of a husband coming to his wife. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the distant city lights. Let him break the silence. He had shattered it, after all. I know you are angry, he began, his tone reasonable, patient. As if explaining a complex theorem to a slow student. This was abrupt. I did not wish for you to learn of it in such a public manner, but the Cyrillus emissaries insisted. It was part of the treaty. So, her humiliation was a footnote in a political negotiation. A bargaining chip. The coldness inside her intensified, burning away any lingering softness. She finally turned, slowly, to face him. She kept her expression neutral, a queen's mask she had perfected over decades. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears or her rage. You wished I had learned of it in private, she asked, her voice quiet, devoid of inflection. So you could what? Explain it to me gently. Convince me of its necessity before I had a chance to object. He seemed taken aback by her composure. He had clearly expected hysterics. So I could make you understand, he corrected, taking a step closer. He looked earnest, his handsome face etched with a sincere desire to be understood. It was this that was the most infuriating thing about him, his absolute conviction in his own righteousness. Ilara, this changes nothing between us. A laugh, sharp and brittle, escaped her before she could stop it. Nothing, she repeated, the word dripping with an irony that was lost on him. You have just installed another woman in my home, in my life, in my very title, and you believe it changes nothing? Lyra is a political necessity, he insisted, his voice laced with frustration. He was not accustomed to being questioned. The alliance with the House of Cyrillus guarantees peace on our northern border for centuries. Centuries, Ilara. It will save thousands of lives, both mortal and immortal. Her presence here is a symbol of that peace. And yes, one day, an heir from her line will secure it for millennia. It is a matter of statecraft. It has nothing to do with you and I. It has everything to do with us, she said, her voice still dangerously calm. Was I not your queen? Is this not my home? You are. It is, he exclaimed, spreading his hands in a gesture of exasperation. You are my first queen. My heart. The queen of my soul. Lyra is the queen of the state. A necessary formality. Can you not see the difference? He truly believed it. In his ancient, pragmatic mind, he had compartmentalized his world. Love was here, duty was there. He could not comprehend that for her, a mortal woman with one life to live, they were inextricably, devastatingly intertwined. He was asking her to accept a divided heart, a divided life, as if it were a perfectly reasonable arrangement. And what am I to do? She asked, the question a piece of ice. Am I to welcome her? Teach her how to please you? Show her which of the servants can be trusted and which wines you prefer with your meals? The word caught in her throat. Am I to sit with her at council meetings, a living relic of your romantic past while she represents your political future? I would expect you to show her grace, he said, his tone shifting, a hint of the king's command bleeding through. She is a frightened child, Ilara. She is as much a victim of this arrangement as anyone. Do not, she whispered, and for the first time, a tremor of fury entered her voice, compare me to her. She has a future in this castle. You have just shown me, in front of your entire court, that I do not. He sighed, a sound of deep weariness, and ran a hand through his dark hair. You are twisting my words. My actions. I did this to protect the kingdom. To protect you. A stable kingdom is a safe kingdom. You are safer now than you were yesterday. It was the ultimate arrogance. He had broken her heart to keep her safe. He had destroyed her world and called it a gift. The gap between them was no longer a space that could be crossed by words or touch. It was a chasm, centuries wide, carved by the fundamental difference in their natures. He saw time as an endless ocean, she saw it as a river, and she was nearing the sea. He was planning for an eternity she would never share. "I understand," she said, and the quiet finality in her voice finally seemed to penetrate his armor of self-justification. He looked at her, truly looked at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his stormy eyes. "You do?" he asked, a hopeful note in his voice. "Yes," she said. "You are a king. And a king does what he must. You have made your choice." She walked past him, toward the dressing room. He did not try to stop her. He watched her go, a frown creasing his brow, sensing a shift in the current but not understanding its direction or its depth. He thought he had weathered the storm. He thought that with time, she would acquiesce. He thought this was a conversation, an argument. He did not understand that it was a farewell. She had listened to his logic, his justifications, his earnest, heartfelt, world-shattering pronouncements. And in the quiet spaces between his words, she had made a decision. He had announced his future. Now, she would begin to build hers. Dawn was a promise whispered on the eastern horizon, a faint blush of gray against the deep indigo of the receding night. The onyx citadel was quiet, steeped in the heavy silence that precedes the day. The immortals slept, prisoners of the coming sun, their power and their plots held in abeyance. It was in this liminal space, this brief pause between the reign of night and the rule of day, that Ilara moved. She did not pack for a queen's journey. There were no trunks filled with velvet gowns, no jewel cases heavy with the ransom of nations. Her departure was not an exile, it was an abdication. She moved through the opulent chambers that had been her cage for 27 years and gathered the fragments of her real life. From a locked drawer in her writing desk, she took a small, leather-bound volume of mortal poetry. Its spine was cracked, the pages softened by countless readings. It had been a gift from her father, the last thing he had given her before Cation had swept her into his world. She ran her thumb over the worn cover, the scent of old paper and ink a ghost from another lifetime. Beside it lay a single, pressed snowdrop, preserved between sheets of waxed paper. She and Cation had found it on their first walk together outside the citadel walls, a tiny, defiant speck of white in the last snows of winter. He had called it a symbol of her. Fragile, but tenacious. A lifetime ago. She tucked them both into a simple leather satchel. She bypassed the wardrobe with its rows of exquisite gowns, the armoire with its fortune in gems. Instead, she chose the simplest things. A traveler's cloak of dark, heavy wool, practical and warm. Sturdy leather boots, well worn and comfortable. A plain tunic and breeches of dark grey linen. The clothes of a common woman. The clothes of the woman she had been before she became a queen. Putting them on felt like shedding a skin. The silks and velvets had been a costume, and the play was over. In the ashes of the hearth, she burned the rose he had left for her. She watched the petals blacken and curl, the sweet scent turning acrid. It was a small, petty act of destruction, but it felt necessary. A severing. Her final act in the chambers was to write a letter. Not to him. There was nothing left to say to him that she had not already said with her silence. The letter was for Anya, her handmaiden for the past decade, a quiet, observant woman with loyalty etched into the lines of her face. The note was brief and practical. It detailed the location of the household keys, the schedule of the mortal staff, a few notes on Lyra's probable needs. She is young and she is frightened. See that she is treated with kindness. It was a final act of queenship, a passing of the torch, a duty performed even in the heart of her own betrayal. She left the note on her pillow, beside the indentation where his head would have lain, had he come to their bed. He had not. With the satchel over her shoulder and the cloak pulled up to hide her face, she slipped out of the royal chambers. The corridors were deserted, lit only by the guttering torches that would be extinguished at sunrise. Her footsteps made no sound on the stone floors. She moved like a ghost through her own life, a silent observer of the stage she was now abandoning. The silence was her accomplice, her shield. As she passed the wing that housed the guest suites, the suites that would now, presumably, become the new queen's permanent residence, a door opened. A sliver of light spilled into the hallway, and Lyra stepped out. The girl was still in her silver gown, now rumpled and creased. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She clutched a velvet wrap around her shoulders, a lost child in a palace of monsters. She had clearly been unable to sleep. Lyra froze when she saw Elara, her eyes widening in fresh terror. She looked like a deer cornered by a wolf. She opened her mouth, then closed it, a small, pathetic sound dying in her throat. Elara stopped. Every instinct screamed at her to keep walking, to ignore the girl and continue on her path to freedom. But she looked at Lyra's terrified face, at the sheer, overwhelming loneliness radiating from her, and saw not a rival, but a mirror. A reflection of herself, 27 years younger. "You are awake early," Elara said, her voice soft, not unkind. Lyra flinched at the sound, then gave a jerky, aborted curtsy. Your Majesty," she stammered. I could not sleep." "Nor I," Elara replied. A heavy silence fell between them, thick with all the things that could not be said. The girl stood there, trembling, waiting for the blow to fall. For the older queen's rage, her jealousy, her hatred. "I am sorry," Lyra whispered, the words a barely audible breath. Tears welled in her sky-blue eyes and began to trace paths down her pale cheeks. "I did not want this. My father, the treaty. I had no choice." "No," Elara said, her voice holding a strange, weary tenderness. "No, you did not. We are rarely given a choice in these matters." She looked at the girl, truly looked at her, and saw the cage being built around her, the same gilded cage Elara was now escaping. "A piece of advice, Lyra." The girl looked up, her expression a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Do not try to understand him," Elara said quietly. "You cannot. His heart beats to a rhythm that is 1,000 years old. It is not a failing in you that you will not be able to decipher it. It is simply a fact of his nature." She paused, the words costing her more than she expected. "He will tell you that he loves you. He will believe it. But his love is a collector's love. He cherishes beautiful, fragile things. He puts them on display. He does not understand that they need to breathe." Lyra stared at her, the tears forgotten, her expression one of dawning, horrified comprehension. "Your only hope," Elara continued, her voice dropping even lower, "is to make him see you. Not the symbol, not the treaty, not the pretty mortal girl. You. If you can do that, you may find a kind of happiness here. If you cannot," she let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. "Learn to build a world for yourself within these walls. A place he cannot touch." She had said too much. She had given away a piece of her own pain, a shard of her hard-won wisdom. It was a gift she hadn't intended to give. She pulled her cloak tighter around herself. "Go back to your room, child," she said, her voice once again that of a queen. "Try to sleep. The days here are long and quiet. You will need your strength for the nights." Without another word, she turned and continued down the corridor, leaving the new queen standing alone in the hallway, a silver statue weeping in the dying torchlight. The encounter had not brought her peace, but it had clarified her purpose. She was not just running from a broken heart. She was running towards a life where she was more than a beautiful, fragile thing. The great gate of the Onyx Citadel was a colossal structure of iron and obsidian, designed to repel armies. As the sky began to lighten from black to a deep, bruised purple, Elara approached it. The two guards on duty, young fledglings from a minor house, straightened as she emerged from the shadows. Their expressions were a mixture of confusion and alarm. They had seen her at the feast. They knew who she was, and they knew what had happened. "Your Majesty," one of them said, his voice rough with sleep and surprise. "It is not yet dawn. The gates are sealed until sunrise." "Open them," Elara said. It was not a request. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of 27 years of command. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to. For this one last moment, she was still their queen. The guards exchanged a nervous glance. "But, Your Majesty, the king's orders are absolute. No one enters or leaves during the dark hours. It is for the safety of the city." I am aware of the king's orders, she replied, her gaze steady and unwavering. I am giving you a new one. I am leaving. The finality of the statement hung in the cold air between them. Leaving. Not going for a ride, not visiting the city. Leaving. The word was an act of rebellion. It was treason, spoken quietly. We cannot, Your Majesty, the second guard stammered, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. He was afraid. Not of her, but of Cation. Of the consequences of disobeying one royal command to obey another. We would have to wake the captain of the guard. We would need the king's direct. By the time you have woken your captain, and he has woken the king, I will be gone, Elara said, taking a step closer. The guards flinched back. She was a mortal woman, unarmored, with no weapon but the authority she was in the process of abandoning. Yet, they were afraid of her. Or rather, of the chaos her actions would unleash. You have two choices. You can open this gate for your queen, or you can explain to your king why you laid hands on her to stop her from leaving. Choose. She saw the conflict in their eyes, the frantic calculation. They were caught between two impossible orders. Disobeying a direct command from the king was a death sentence. But assaulting his queen, the queen he had publicly lauded for her grace and wisdom only hours before, that was unthinkable. She had presented them with a paradox, and their immortal, rule-bound minds could not resolve it. Finally, the first guard, the braver of the two, gave a short, sharp nod. He strode to the massive winch mechanism set into the wall. With a grunt of effort, he began to turn the wheel. The sound of the great iron chains gathering was deafening in the pre-dawn stillness. Slowly, ponderously, a smaller door set within the main gate, the postern gate, just large enough for a person on foot, began to lift. It opened onto a world washed in the pale, ethereal grey of first light. A cool, clean wind swept in, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was the smell of freedom. Elara walked toward the opening without a backward glance. As she passed the guards, she paused for a barest second. You have served your queen well, she said softly. It was both an absolution and a dismissal. She stepped through the gate. The moment her foot touched the stone bridge that spanned the chasm surrounding the citadel, she felt a change. A weight she had carried for 27 years lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer Queen Elara. She was no longer Cation's cherished object. She was just Elara. A woman of 47, with a small satchel, a warm cloak, and an entire, unknown world stretched out before her. The gate closed behind her with a heavy, final thud. The sound echoed across the chasm, a full stop at the end of a long and painful sentence. It was her announcement. Not a proclamation shouted in a gilded hall, but a quiet act of defiance. He had announced her replacement. She had announced her departure. And as the first true rays of sunlight crested the distant mountains, bathing the world in a fragile, golden light, she began to walk. Cation awoke to an absence. It was not a sound or a sight, but a feeling. A void in the space beside him in the vast bed. He reached out, his hand sweeping across the cold, empty expanse of silk sheets. Elara was not there. He sat up, a flicker of irritation cutting through the lingering haze of his shallow, daylight sleep. So, she was still angry. He had expected as much. He had returned to their chambers hours after the feast, exhausted by the endless political niceties, the veiled threats from Valerus, the sycophantic congratulations from lesser lords. He had found the room empty, the serpent's tear lying like a reproach on the windowsill. He had assumed she had retired to one of the antechambers to nurse her wounded pride. He had let her. In his experience, human emotions were like storms, violent, brief, and best weathered from a distance. He had believed that by morning, the worst of her fury would have passed, leaving behind a manageable sadness he could soothe with gifts and promises. He rose from the bed, the pre-dawn light filtering through the enchanted glass of the windows, casting the room in shades of grey. The fire was dead, a pile of black ash in the hearth. The air was cold. He called her name. Elara. The silence that answered him was absolute. It was not the quiet of sleep, but the profound emptiness of an abandoned space. A thread of genuine unease began to unwind in his chest. This was not like her. Even in their worst arguments, She had never been able to abide a true silence between them. She would seek him out, her eyes flashing with anger or bright with unshed tears, and demand to be heard. He saw the folded note on her pillow. Relief washed over him. A note. Words. The beginning of a negotiation. He picked it up, expecting a torrent of recrimination, a list of her grievances. But the note was not for him. It was addressed to Anya, her handmaiden. His brow furrowed in confusion. He unfolded it. The script was Alara's familiar, elegant hand, but the words were stark, impersonal. They were instructions. The keys are in the top right drawer of the writing desk. See that the mortal staff are paid their weekly wages. The girl, Lyra, will need guidance. Be kind. He read the words again. And again. They were the words of someone settling their affairs. The words of someone who was not coming back. The cold unease in his chest sharpened into something that felt alarmingly like panic. He strode into her dressing room. It was pristine. The rows of gowns hung untouched, the jewels sat cold in their cases. But the simple woolen cloak she favored for walking in the gardens was gone. Her sturdy boots were missing. He returned to the main chamber, his mind racing, trying to piece it together. The public announcement. Her unnatural calm. Her quiet, chilling statement, "You have made your choice." He had thought she meant she accepted it. He had mistaken her surrender for acquiescence. The staggering depth of his own arrogance struck him like a physical blow. Just then, a frantic pounding came at the chamber door. It was not the polite knock of a servant. It was the urgent summons of a crisis. "Enter," he roared, his voice raw. The door flew open and the captain of the guard, a grim-faced vampire named Lucian, burst in, foregoing all protocol. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear Cation had never seen in him. "My king," Lucian breathed, bowing hastily. "The queen." "What about the queen?" Cation demanded, his voice a low growl. "She is gone, sire." The words hung in the air, simple, devastating. "Gone where?" "Left the citadel. The guards at the great gate. They let her pass just before dawn." Lucian swallowed hard. "They said she gave the order. They said she was their queen." Cation felt the floor drop out from under him. Gone. Not to another room. Not to the gardens. Gone. She had walked out of his life. He stared at Lucian, but he did not see him. He saw Alara's face at the feast, her expression a mask of perfect, serene grace as she lifted her goblet. To the future. It had not been a toast. It had been a warning. A farewell. Her silent, dignified rebellion. What did she take with she? He asked, the question sounding foolish even to his own ears. "A small satchel, sire." Nothing more. Nothing. She had left the jewels, the gowns, the wealth, the title. She had left him. She had walked away from 27 years of their life with nothing but a few clothes and a satchel. The insult of it was more profound than any screamed accusation. She had deemed it all worthless. A rage unlike anything he had felt in centuries surged through him. A hot, violent fury directed at the guards, at Lucian, at the smiling emissaries, at the terrified girl in silver, and most of all, at himself. He had been so sure of his logic, so confident in his power to arrange the world as he saw fit. He had treated her heart like a political asset to be managed, and she had responded by proving it was the one thing he could not command. "Seal the city," he snarled, the sound inhuman. "Find her." Lucian paled further. "Sire, the sun. It has risen." Cation stalked to the window, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked out at the world beyond the enchanted glass. The valley was bathed in the golden light of a new day. The sun, his eternal enemy, was high and bright. It was the light that had set her free, and it was the light that now held him prisoner. He, the immortal king, master of the night, was trapped in his own castle, powerless to pursue her. The irony was a physical pain, a burning in his throat. He had made his grand announcement to a captive audience of his subjects. She had made hers to the dawn. And her statement, whispered in the silence of her departure, was infinitely more powerful. He looked around the cold, empty room, at the priceless artifacts and symbols of his power. They were meaningless. The heart of his kingdom, the warmth of his world, had just walked out the gate, and he had been too arrogant to even notice her leaving. The silence she had left behind was louder and more damning than any scream. It was the sound of his own monumental failure. The sun was a shock. For nearly 3 decades, Elara had experienced daylight only through the filtered, softened lens of the citadel's enchanted windows, or during brief, heavily chaperoned walks in shaded gardens. To feel its unfiltered warmth on her face was a raw, primal sensation. It was more than light. It was a presence, a force. It painted the world in colors she had almost forgotten, turning the dew on the grass into a field of diamonds and warming the dark wool of her cloak. It felt like a benediction. The road away from the onyx citadel was a simple dirt track winding down from the high mountain pass into the sprawling green valley below. With every step, the citadel shrank behind her, its dark towers looking less like a fortress and more like a jagged, broken tooth against the morning sky. The air was clean and sharp, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a stark contrast to the perfumed, stagnant air of the court. She inhaled deeply, the cold air a bracing shock to her lungs. It was the scent of a world that was alive in a way the citadel, for all its eternal inhabitants, had never been. She walked for hours, her body, softened by years of luxury, protesting at first. Her muscles ached. Her feet, accustomed to soft slippers, began to blister in the sturdy boots. But she pushed on, fueled by a strange, fierce energy. It was the energy of pure, unadulterated freedom. No one followed her. No one watched her. Her movements were not being observed, catalogued, or judged. For the first time since she was a girl, she was completely, terrifyingly alone. And she was afraid. The world outside the gilded cage was vast and indifferent. She had no money, save for a few small coins she had sewn into the hem of her cloak years ago, a forgotten precaution from a time when she still remembered to be afraid. She had no destination. She had no skills, other than navigating the treacherous currents of courtly politics and managing a household of immortal servants. She was a queen with no kingdom, no subjects, no purpose. The thought was paralyzing. Who was she, if not Caitian's Elara? She stopped by a small, rushing stream to drink, cupping the icy water in her hands. As she knelt by the bank, she saw her reflection. Not in a polished silver mirror, but in the shifting, clear water. The face that looked back was a stranger's. It was the face of a woman of 47, flushed from exertion, her hair coming loose from its simple braid, strands of silver catching the sun like spun metal. There were worry lines on her brow and the faint tracks of sleeplessness beneath her eyes. It was a tired face. An aging face. A human face. And for the first time, looking at it, she felt no shame, no fear of its imperfections. It was simply her. The contents of her satchel were meager comfort. The book of poetry, the pressed flower. They were anchors to a past she had just severed. She considered leaving them behind, throwing them into the stream to be carried away. But she couldn't. They were not just memories of him, they were memories of herself. The girl who loved poetry, the young woman who saw beauty in a simple wildflower. She had to carry them, at least for a little while longer, to remember who she was before she had been remade in his image. By midday, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. She found a small clearing off the road, sheltered by ancient, moss-covered oaks, and sat down, her back against a trunk. The fear returned, a cold knot in her stomach. What now? She could walk until she reached a town or a village, but then what? Beg. She, who had commanded the wealth of a nation? The absurdity of her situation was overwhelming. She had traded a life of absolute luxury for absolute uncertainty. Had it been a mistake? A fit of prideful, self-destructive pique? A memory surfaced, unbidden. A conversation with Caitian, years ago. They had been looking at a tapestry depicting a mortal queen who had been overthrown. Her mistake, Caitian had said, his voice cool and analytical, was that her identity was entirely dependent on her crown. When she lost it, she had nothing left. She became a ghost. Was that her fate? To become a ghost, haunting the edges of the world? The thought chilled her more than the mountain air. No. She would not allow it. Her departure was not an end. It had to be a beginning. She had not left the citadel to disappear, she had left to find herself. She took a deep breath, forcing the panic down. She was not helpless. She was educated. She could read and write, skills not common in the rural villages. She knew herbs and remedies, a knowledge gleaned from the citadel's healers. She knew how to manage resources, how to organize, how to lead with a quiet word rather than a loud command. These were not the skills of a warrior or a mage, but they were skills nonetheless. They were the tools of survival. A small brown bird landed on a branch just above her head, tilting its head and regarding her with a bright, curious eye. It sang a few clear, sharp notes, then flew away. The simple, unburdened beauty of the moment pierced through her anxiety. The world was not just indifferent, it was also beautiful. It was full of small, living things that knew nothing of kings or queens or treaties. It was a world that existed entirely outside the suffocating drama of the Onyx Citadel. A new resolve settled over her, quieter but stronger than the fierce energy that had propelled her out of the gates. This was her new kingdom. Not the sprawling territories on Caitian's maps, but the small patch of sunlight she was sitting in. Her new duty was not to a nation, but to herself. To the tired, frightened, 47-year-old woman with the aching feet and the uncertain future. She got to her feet, her joints protesting. She brushed the leaves from her cloak and looked down the road, which disappeared into the green haze of the valley. She did not know what lay at the end of it. It could be hardship, loneliness, or an early grave. But it was her road. Her choice. For 27 years, her path had been paved for her with obsidian and velvet. This rough, uncertain dirt track was the first road she had chosen for herself. And as she took her first step onto it, she felt not the terror of the unknown, but the quiet, profound joy of a journey just beginning. 6 months. It was a blink of an eye to the inhabitants of the Onyx Citadel, but for Elara, it was a lifetime. She had followed the winding road down from the mountains, through the lush, green valleys of Caitian's domain, and beyond. She had walked until her boots were worn through and her feet were calloused and strong. She had traveled until the shadow of the citadel was no longer a weight on her soul but a distant, hazy memory. She found her way to a small, forgotten fishing village on the coast, a place called Saltwind. It was a cluster of stone cottages huddled against the relentless push of the sea, its air permanently tasting of salt and brine. The people were hardy and taciturn, their faces weathered by the sun and wind, their hands rough from mending nets and hauling catches. They were not interested in where she came from, they were interested in whether she could work. She told them her name was Elara, and that she was a widow from the interior whose husband's lands had been lost to border skirmishes. It was a simple, believable lie. Her fine speech and educated hands marked her as an outsider, but her willingness to work earned her a grudging acceptance. She found a room in the attic of the innkeeper's house, small and draughty, with a window that looked out over the churning grey sea. It was more hers than the opulent chambers in the citadel had ever been. Her days fell into a new rhythm, dictated not by court schedules but by the tides. She helped the innkeeper's wife, a bustling, no-nonsense woman named Maeve, with the mending and the bookkeeping. Her neat script and quick mind with figures were a marvel in a town where most could barely sign their own names. She learned to gut fish, her once soft hands growing rough and capable. She learned to read the sky for weather and the sea for its moods. She learned the names of the constellations, the true, unfiltered stars, not the pale imitations that had floated in the ceiling of the great hall. The work was hard, her body often ached with a weariness she had never known, but it was a clean, honest exhaustion. At night, she would fall into her narrow bed and sleep a deep, dreamless sleep, the sound of the waves a constant, soothing lullaby. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, the past would return. A certain slant of light at dusk would remind her of Caitian's eyes. The scent of wood smoke would evoke the hearth in their chambers. The memories were no longer sharp, agonizing shards of glass. They were smooth, worn stones, heavy in her pocket but no longer cutting. She remembered the love, the tenderness, the shared laughter. She grieved for it, for the man he had been to her, and for the woman she had been with him. But the grief was a quiet companion now, not a consuming monster. One evening, a traveling merchant stopped at the inn, his wares spread out on a table in the common room. Among the trinkets and bolts of cloth, there was a small, crudely made-looking glass. Ilara picked it up. The glass was warped and uneven, her reflection a distorted, wavering image. She saw a woman she barely recognized. Her skin was tanned and weathered by the sun and wind. Her hair, now cut short for practicality, was more silver than black. Her hands, holding the mirror, were chapped and scarred. There were lines on her face she had never seen before, etched by squinting into the sun and by the simple act of living. She was no longer beautiful by the standards of the court. She was no longer a cherished, fragile object. She looked her age, and then some. And yet, for the first time, she saw a strength in her own face that had not been there before. It was the strength of a woman who had survived. A woman who had walked away from a king and built a life from nothing. A woman who was entirely her own. She bought the mirror for 2 copper coins and hung it on the wall of her small room. As winter approached, the sea grew rougher, the winds colder. The fishing boats stayed in the harbor more often than not, and the men gathered in the inn's common room, drinking ale and telling stories. Ilara would sit by the fire, mending nets, listening to their tales of sea monsters and lost treasures. They were simple, fantastical stories, but they were real in a way the epic, blood-soaked histories of Kashan's court had never been. One night, a fisherman just returned from a trip to a larger port city further down the coast brought news. He spoke of the vampire king in the north, how there was talk of unrest in his kingdom. He said the king had taken a second, younger queen, but that the court was unsettled. The old noble houses were restive, and the king himself was said to have grown colder, more withdrawn. He mentioned, as a piece of strange gossip, that the king's first queen, a human woman, had vanished on the night the second was announced. Some said the new queen had had her killed. Others said she had simply withered away from a broken heart. Ilara listened, her needle pausing in its work. She felt a faint, distant pang for the kingdom she had left behind, for the man she had once loved. He was suffering. His perfect, logical solution had not brought him the stability he craved. It had brought him discord. He had broken the heart of his kingdom, and now it was failing him. There was a grim, tragic justice in it. But it was not her story anymore. She looked around the warm, firelit common room. She saw Maeve, her face creased in a smile as she listened to the fisherman's tale. She saw the men, their faces animated in the telling. She saw the simple, hard, real life she had built here. Later that night, in her small attic room, she stood before her little mirror. The wind howled outside, rattling the window frame. She looked at her own reflection, at the weathered face of the woman she had become. She was no longer Queen Ilara of the Onyx Citadel. She was Ilara of Saltwind. A woman who mended nets and kept accounts. A woman who was respected not for her beauty or her title, but for the strength in her hands and the quiet wisdom in her eyes. She thought of the young girl, Lyra, and hoped she had found a way to build a world for herself within those cold stone walls. She thought of Kashan, alone on his throne, surrounded by the consequences of his choices. A flicker of pity, faint as a dying ember, touched her heart. He had all the time in the world, and yet he did not know how to live. She had only a few years left, a decade, maybe 2 if she was lucky. But she was living every moment of it. She turned from the mirror and looked out the window at the dark, churning sea. The moon traced a silver path across the waves. It was the same moon that shone on the Onyx Citadel, on the king in his lonely grandeur. But here, it felt different. It was not a harbinger of the night he ruled. It was just the moon, beautiful and remote, illuminating a world of infinite possibility. She had not withered away. She had not become a ghost. She had been reborn. And as the sound of the sea filled the silence, she felt a profound, unshakable peace. It was the peace of a journey ended, and a life truly begun.